It's F1 summer break time, the summer shutdown, potentially silly season, we'll get onto that later. Whatever you call it, it's here, 12 races down, 10 to go. What a unique season it's been so far. I'm Martyn Lee from the Autosport podcast. Joining me today are Alex Kalinauckas and Matt Q. Welcome, guys. Before we kick off, let's have a look at where the standings shake out. Verstappen is a country mile ahead, with Perez having just over half the points behind him in second. And this is where the real battles begin further down. With Alonso and Hamilton neck and neck, Leclerc, Russell and Sainz battling it out, Norris in a gap all of his own, thanks to McLaren's recent boost in performance, followed by the rest of the midfield and beyond. Okay, constructors, well, similar story when we look at this. Red Bull have doubled the points of second place Mercedes, closely behind Aston and Ferrari duking it out. Then McLaren climbing up the ranks. Alpine are doing a bit of a solo fight there. And we can see Williams, Haas, Alfa Romeo and AlphaTauri down at the tail end. So, gents, let's get into it. You've both been racking up the air miles for our readers, our viewers, our listeners to the podcast so far this year. We've been sending you far and wide to cover Formula One. How have you found the season so far? Alphabetical order. We'll start with A for Alex. How's the season been?
The season's been, I mean, from one point of view, you know, we get to do these wonderful jobs, as you said, Martyn. They are quite tiring. You know, it was a 9 till midnight, 9 till 3 a.m. Double up at the sprint weekend in Spa. I'm not personally a big fan of the sprint race format for that exact reason. It is a bit tiring, but we chose to live these ridiculous lives, so we've got to get on with it. So yeah, good on the one hand, enjoying travelling the world and seeing a Formula One season developing. On the other hand, that season has been really boring. Like there's no getting away from it. It's sort of, I think Spa summed it up quite nicely. It's good that we're doing this now. Also, well, we are doing this now because it's the summer break, right? But following on from that event, you had really interesting battles in the pack at Spa in terms of, I think there's some nice overtaking from Lando Norris when the McLaren's rear wing was being helpful in the rain. Alex Albon, Yuki Tsunoda, the Alpines, they were getting stuck in. But up front, Max Verstappen had gone from 6th to 1st with no opposition. Sergio Perez is not on his level. And that's it. That sums up the season, really. Good behind, excellent behind, I think, as we probably come on to say. Terrible up front. On the sort of addition to that, it's wonderful to be able to watch F1 greatness in action. I think we'll look back on this current Red Bull domination and say, well, this is Schumacher Ferrari level, you know, going back through the years. It's McLaren domination level from the 70s and beyond that. It's really special, and that's good to be able to see. So yeah, conflicting so far this season, I would say.
I agree with most of Alex's sentiments, really. It is excellent to sort of sit back and watch Verstappen tear these records up. I think I pitched a column last year after Red Bull had like a few glitches throughout, you know, a couple of sticky wheel nuts and whatever, going, yeah, but what if they get everything together and they'll win the race by 30 seconds? That would be kind of cool to watch. Now it's every race is won by 30 seconds. And yeah, in the heat of the moment, not the most thrilling, the argument that there's been overtakes, but not a lot of racing with a few sort of midfield exceptions in Spa. It's not been mega, but yeah, to sit back and go, this is it. Although I feel slightly shortchanged by that, because as we've discussed on other podcasts and videos, the RB19 is a mega jack of all trades, but it's not a master of any, I don't think. You're not sitting back there and going, wow, this is such a landmark performance. It's more that it's just brilliant at everything and exposing how Ferrari, Mercedes, whoever haven't caught up, and it's sort of a bit sad in that respect. However, the off-track stuff has been pretty compelling. So, you know, we've already had a driver be binned, Ricciardo come back. You know, hot off the press is the Alpine madness. There's already a few rumours circulating about silly season. It's not going to be a patch on Vettel retiring, Alonso to Aston Martin, Alpine announcing Piastri, and Piastri, you know, being settled via the courts. But there's a few things bubbling away. You know, who Ferrari are trying to hire to get through their rebuild phase, cost cap allegations and stuff. So that's all sort of coming along quite nicely in the background. And I think second half of the season, the first half is anything to go by. That'll be where the intrigue, the readership, the viewers, that's where it comes from, probably.
Yeah, I've been trying to follow up on what you said, which is about this not feeling like, you know, living through an all-time great title, sort of witnessing anything amazing, even though it is going to break all sorts of records. I saw somebody do a social media post where they kind of ranked the teammates, and they were trying to get across the point that Lewis had some pretty handy teammates at times. Heikki had some, you know, good races. JB outscored him on points. Bottas is good. Rosberg, of course, was a world champion, and a certain Alonso. he's pretty handy at times. And someone was trying to say, well, look, Verstappen, who they've put in the second seat, has never really forced him to have amazing battles. I don't know if I fully agree with that or not. Let us know in the comments below. Dutch fans might disagree, but let us know what you think. We'll get on actually to Red Bull a little bit later. We won't do it in championship order because I think there are some really interesting talking points, and one of those that fascinates me is Aston Martin started the season as potential title contenders, so we'll keep our hats on. Bearing in mind, go back to the beginning of the season, really good pace, and we were thinking, well, hang on, what's going to happen here? Alonso always on the podium. Can they develop maybe Red Bull with that cost cap sort of implications? And the season's turned out differently, we know that, but try and cast your mind back, and it's been quite a few races really since we've seen that stellar form that we saw earlier in the season. Matt, what do Aston Martin need to get back on top? / clickbait headline, where has it all gone wrong?
I think I'll start off by saying third in the points. I think they're 5 ahead of Ferrari at the minute, so it is close. But despite the drop off in form, any Aston Martin employee would have bitten your hand off for that at the end of last season when they finished 7th, and that came down to the last race with Alfa Romeo. So standalone, mega, still a great subplot, and as the new factory, wind tunnel facilities all sort of progress, this is like the baseline. They will accelerate from this in other seasons if they've already turned attention to 2024 car that's beginning. Basically, this is the first step, so maybe they can challenge Red Bull down the line, so that is exciting and kudos to them. But yeah, there has been a marked drop off, and you can pretty much pinpoint it down to the race where you had the run of Fernando Alonso podiums, and then apart from Monaco, I don't think he's featured in the top 3 again. There is a reason for that we're sort of slowly piecing together and trying to understand, but the nuts and bolts of it, we can't confirm it yet because it's still a bit early, but it sounds like Aston Martin had a bit on the car that they then couldn't run anymore, and that has knocked their performance markedly. And it's taken the races up to the summer break to bring that back. So Hungary, the cliche, and it's limited, but it is like Monaco without walls. So that that should have been Fernando Alonso, only a few thousandths off pole and fighting for second position like he did in Monaco. Instead, it was sort of lower reaches of the top 10, not as convincing a performance. And so that sort of says where the performance has dropped off. But there's still sort of that half-tenth gap to Red Bull that they were at the start of the season. So yes, Aston Martin have fallen behind the likes of McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes, a bit more sort of convincingly than where they were, but it's not a disaster. It's not as if they've taken the car down the wrong development path and they've discovered it's wrong, ripped up all their homework, and they've cost themselves a load of tenths. It's more that they've had to just sort of reset a little bit and refine their form. It's not as if their understanding or their working out is wrong. It's just they got asked to not do something which they were doing. So they've said because of that, they use Spa as like a glorified test weekend and are pretty happy with how it came out. So second half of the season, they should be a bit more competitive, with the caveat that their second race back is Monza, where if they find their early season form again, well, their form didn't come from long straights, and it didn't come from sort of straight line efficiency or top speed. It was all about high downforce and mechanical grip. So, okay, you've got the chicanes at Monza, but when it's dominated by straight line performance, I don't think you'll necessarily see an instant uptick, but I think the results sort of will level off, but in a good way.
The other thing to consider with Aston is that they've only had one car in the fight. I think I actually haven't done the analysis from after Hungary and Spa, but I looked up to all the races up to Hungary, and of all the teammate battles, of those that had scored points, because not every teammate had scored points, so AlphaTauri and Williams with Logan Sargent and the Nick de Vries, Daniel Ricciardo situation, you had to sort of ignore that. But of all the teams that had scored points, only Haas was below Aston Martin in terms of the percentage swing. Like Lance Stroll was just not delivering on Fernando Alonso's level. That ultimately could cost them millions in prize money at the end of the year. There was also this suggestion that Alonso flagged up that the change of tyre construction from Pirelli from Silverstone, he said that was what was contributing to Aston's slightly back down from the being the Red Bull bothering team, rather undone by his team boss Mike Crack saying we simply don't have the data that supports that in Spa. So possibly some Fernando Alonso games going on there. He's very, very good at such as that, things like that. But yeah, work to do from Aston. But I think one of the key things that Matt said was that they really would have taken this after where they started 2022. It was so bad at the start of last season, porpoising awfully, but most of all just lacking downforce. And the progress they've made, backed up by huge investment from Lawrence Stroll, is seriously impressive.
Okay, moving on. Like I say, not doing this in championship order, but I think perhaps storyline order. And I think the next story I'd like to pick at with you guys is the inverse Aston Martin. And that would be McLaren started the season struggling for points. They came out of the gates and said they'd missed all of their targets over the Christmas period. And, well, Austria came around where Lando received the first part of the car's overhaul and turned up in fourth. Since then, we've seen podiums. Don't know if we call the sprint result a podium, but either way, we've seen some fantastic results for the team and the drivers as well. Lando leads the way in the drivers' battle, but that's not surprising. Oscar Piastri being it's his rookie season, but very, very highly rated. Wasn't given the tools earlier in the season to compete properly. Alex, what are your thoughts on the year that McLaren have had so far?
Yeah, unfortunately for Oscar Piastri, can't call that a podium from what he secured in Spa because they don't go and stand on it, do they? Although, actually, give the listeners and the viewers a little bit of insight. I've never watched a single thing of what happens after a sprint race because I have to do the report for Autosport.com when I'm there. It goes on Motorsport.com as well, right? I'm finishing that and then I'm legging it to the press conference room because the logistics is the top three go there before they do their TV things. So who knows? They might do something completely random, but I'm pretty sure that Max Verstappen just gets a medal from the FIA president or he gets a medal from someone. Anyway. Or a wreath. There was a wreath at one point. Anyway, I'm just delving deep into my memories there. But yeah, McLaren. I mean, it's really interesting. It's very similar story to Aston Martin, right? McLaren is investing massively right now. You know, we know it came from a very poor place financially, as Aston did before Lawrence Stroll got involved. It got that investment, over the sort of the pandemic years. McLaren, it's gone to the point of like selling the land of its factory and renting it back out and things like that. It's really doing what it can to exploit things on the financial front. And it's making big hires. You've got Rob Marshall coming from McLaren. Red Bull have not been subtle in suggesting how much he's being paid by McLaren to go and do that. And at the start of the year, you'd say, well, hang on a minute, what's it all been for? They've come out very openly, very frankly, Andrea Stella, Zach Brown saying, look, we're not going to be good for at least 4 races until we bring a new floor in Baku. And even then, the floor came along and it was like, oh, okay, yeah, it was worth a bit, but Lando Norris was still slagging the car off every opportunity he got. Suddenly, as you say, Martin, we get to Austria and the changes really made a difference. It was Aston-like the step that they made from going nowhere in the back of the midfield, absolutely nowhere, on pace, in the early races. Australia, they were absolutely appalling. What a step. So fair play to McLaren. The work they've done has paid off. It's also backed up by excellence from its two drivers. I think, we joked about Oscar Piastri's podium, non-podium in Spa. What a great start to life as a rookie. Lando Norris under pressure, finally, after a couple of years alongside Daniel Ricciardo. But he can deliver, as we saw at Silverstone and in Austria as well. So, yeah, very good from those two. But I think, actually, one of the key things I wanted to say on this video, on this podcast, I probably might even write a column about it for Autosport.com and Autosport Magazine, is Andrea Stella. Signing of the season, even though he was already there. Promotion of the season. Fine, let's go for that. He's been terrific. Okay, you could just say, oh, it's a coincidence, it's a result of a huge hundreds, thousands of people working on something. But nevertheless, he's been a great figurehead. And for us in the media, he gives excellent explanations. He just seems to totally get it. And this all coming from a man we were told didn't like doing any of the media stuff. So a good positive story for McLaren, having started from a very, very negative one.
Matt, I should probably throw in here Andreas Seidel going to be the CEO of Sauber Group and setting up that operation in anticipation of Audi coming in. And people might be thinking, well, hang on, one guy goes, another guy comes in, McLaren find form all of a sudden, we'll wheel out the old sort of turning around, tanker cliche with Formula One teams. Doesn't happen overnight, but he was certainly rated enormously highly in the paddock, and he still is in the paddock. But there's no doubt that some of the changes at McLaren have also come at a time when the form has come around. Matt, do you think that the personnel changes are a part of it at all?
An essential part to it, yeah. They lost your long-lost twin brother, Andreas Seidel, to Sauber.
We do look so similar for some reason. It's the glasses.
And as Alex says, I know this is a mid-season review, so we're going to be repeating some topics from like previous podcasts and videos. But as Alex has said, we're just absolutely convinced by Stella. He's got his approach with the media, which is very, very nice, is like no BS, no lies. So he tells everything and he tells it in good detail. And I actually had a sit-down interview with Zach Brown, McLaren Racing CEO, that will be on Autosport.com over the summer break. And I asked basically Austria, Silverstone, Hungary, Spa, what are we seeing there with the uptick? And he said, what you're saying is that is the overlap between the old regime going and everything you see now, everything that's been served up on a plate is come on Stella's watch. So that is James Key going, refining the technical structure. You don't yet have the new wind tunnel online, but what Stella wants is competing ideas. So he wants people to specialise on certain areas and bring conflicting ideas and from that pick the best. And the way they're going about it is just, it's absolute pragmatism. I think that's what's so good. It's almost like a blinkered approach. So for Spa, there was a drop-off in form in the dry, and that's because they've spent so much time, resource, energy on just upgrading the entire car from that, when they said it was having to be realistic at the start of the season. They missed their winter development targets. So everything's been piled into refining the whole car. And that meant they didn't have a Spa spec rear wing, but it doesn't matter because there's only a few tracks, Spa, Monza, where you need that setup. It's about the bigger picture. So that's been really impressive. And I think the snapshot of where McLaren is at now, having taken this massive in-season leap, is that for Spa, they bought a big rear wing and a low drag beam wing, which is not ideal for Spa, but that's what Red Bull have been doing to have this really good DRS effect over the past 2 seasons. And you speak to Red Bull and go, whoa, are you worried it's been copied? And they're going, no. How the hell? This is the best engineers in the world, and it's taken them 18 months and only one team's done similar. Like that's more for them. But that the one team is not Ferrari, it's not it's not Mercedes, it is McLaren. Sort of says of how impressive they are at the minute. Yeah, I'm absolutely convinced by it all.
All right, well, that leads nicely on to a team that didn't go out and copy the quicker cars in 2022. They stuck with their so-called zero side pod philosophy, but we know what's underneath the floor is so much of the juice in Formula One these days. Mercedes have been in an unusual spot this season, but you could also make an argument that, once again, a pretty similar spot, scoring regularly, doing all right. 2022 was a disaster, but you look back at, they finished, behind Ferrari, but you look back and go, well, you kind of scored pretty consistently through the season. You look back at this year, you've not been doing too badly, which in a way disguises the problems that they have. You see the drivers crop up on the podium and you go, oh, okay, Mercedes kind of doing all right, but they're absolutely not. And what do they need to do, Matt, in the second half of this season to at least get themselves in a position to finish second in the championship, to get in position for 2024? Lewis Hamilton, it's not unthinkable that he could finish second in the Drivers' Championship. You've got to say, if Sergio Perez can keep it on the road, he'll finish second. But Matt, what have Mercedes got to do in the next half of the season and going forward?
The sort of flippant answer is focus on 2024. So, although they do look better off than last year, there's not the killer quotes from Toto Wolff about how it's all a shambles. And as far as we know, they're not going to sort of rotate their technical department at the top again. They are 50 points worse off than their nadir of last year. So, and okay, last year you had sort of Red Bull and Ferrari taking strips out of each other, but it was Mercedes more clearly at the pack. Now they have more competition, but you don't get the sense they're any closer to sorting it all out. So you've gone from 0 pods to the Red Bull side pods in Monaco. They had an instant lift as Mercedes upgrades tend to do, and then they've fallen away in the development race. The second place in Spain, brilliant, turned a corner, but then they've fallen away again. And you think actually they were really competitive in Spain last year. So do you have to put that step forward to a sort of an isolated incident at that specific track rather than a massive step forward? So it's not wholly convincing. They're still got this sort of, the way it's been explained is like a treasure map car. So this sort of cuttlefish look, the 0 side pods originally was because in these conditions, in the wind tunnel, that is absolute peak performance in a way that we weren't saying about Red Bull. The Mercedes reckon in the right window you could get it, but the operating window is so incredibly narrow. So last year it was destabilized by bumps. This year, they're running in a state of compromise. Last year, they were too low. At the start of this year, they went too high, and now they're in the middle. But because everything's been designed to run in that higher state of tune, it's all sort of fundamentally a bit misaligned. So none of that is mega. So and that's what it's saying. Like, it's like a treasure map, just getting it in the sweet spot. And as you see time and time again, to the point now, it's a really unfortunate sort of trait of Mercedes is that they're quick in the final stint on a Sunday. But FP1 they're doing one thing, FP2 the other. Qualifying can be hit or miss, and it's only they get the car in a sweet spot right towards the end. It's such a sort of, the wolf line for the last 5 years. It's a diva. Well, this car is. It's so easily unsettled, and some of that is absolutely baked in. So one of the early narratives was Lewis saying, "I feel like I'm sat too far forward in the car, so there's a massive pendulum swing behind me." Well, the chassis is crash tested. There's certain hard points with suspension. There's only so much you can do. So that is fundamentally baked in. But as they've tried to refine it, it does feel like the direction has gone away from Russell. So last year it was, hang on, is Hamilton, is his head still gone from 2021? This new lad's come in and, we know he's very good from Williams, but he's every bit of match. If not, I think that was one of the best debates we had for the top 50 drivers and top 10 F1 drivers of last year was Hamilton or Russell. But this year he seems a bit further behind Hamilton. I think that says sort of how difficult a car it is to drive. Yes, Mike Elliott's gone. Mike Elliott has been moved up a level and James Allison brought back into the day-to-day, but that can bring some mid-season performance. But I think everything has to be about next year's car now. Okay, everyone was surprised at the start of 2022 with this really prescriptive rule book. And then between Mercedes, Ferrari and Red Bull, you had three massively different takes on how to design an AirPod. Well, I'm sorry, sacrifice the design differentiation. You need to go for the Red Bull route. The only slight problem for that with Mercedes is that Red Bull have had 2 years of doing the Red Bull thing and they're pretty good at it. So they've got to really be on a steep learning curve over the winter.
I do think there are things that Mercedes can do short term to make things better in 2023. First of all, we've seen some really quite odd operational mistakes creeping in from Mercedes. Like if you take, for example, Spa sprint shootout qualifying. I never know the terms for that ridiculous session. But anyway, the second qualifying session on the Saturday morning, lunchtime, whenever at Spa last weekend, right? Suddenly, last runs in Q3, it all gets a bit muddy. Verstappen only makes it over the line to start setting his lap with 4 seconds to spare. The Mercedes drivers are ahead of him. George Russell has overtaken Lewis Hamilton into the final corners, locked up at turn 1, and then wrecked Hamilton's lap when he comes back, heading down onto the rest of the straight to Eau Rouge before and after. Right, what that all stemmed from was a little bit that Mercedes explained it as miscommunication, and what happened is that Russell was told it's going to be quite tight here. You need to get on with it. He did. He overtook Hamilton and other drivers at the bus stop chicane. The pressure that then built meant he messed up at La Source, and it had a knock-on effect. Whereas actually, both cars had enough time. It was only Verstappen that was particularly under pressure. So that, I think that's where Mercedes will reflect and think, oh, hang on a minute, this has gone a bit wrong. There was also the collision in qualifying in Spain that was put down to miscommunication. It's little things like that you don't often see from Mercedes. And I think that's something that if they can get that right, that'll at least alleviate a bit of the pressure that can build up from these things. The other thing I think Mercedes can do this year, and this really does concern the drivers centrally, is sort out the contract situations. This Lewis Hamilton new deal that we're being told is all done. It's with the lawyers. Well, it's been with the lawyers for quite a while now. Toto Wolff said back at the beginning of June it was going to be announced in a few days. He said that at one of the conference he and Hamilton were at in New York, but it never came to pass. So what actually is the hold up? Are we just being spun this? Oh, it's lawyers, because actually there's something more fundamental going on. You would suspect this is just Mercedes wanting to do things very thoroughly, and it wouldn't surprise me at all to see at some point in the future that this announcement does come, and as part of that maybe there'll be some sort of investment in Russell. It would be a logical time to expect them to make a contract extension put in place for him. So yeah, that at the very least would stop the questions going on about it and would help them feel settled. We know drivers have spoken about the importance of knowing their long-term futures are secure, and even with a driver like Lewis Hamilton, I mean, take for example Fernando Alonso, when he was at Alpine last year and they were going, oh, we think you're a bit too old, actually we'd rather have, which made no sense at all. He was so outraged about that. First opportunity he got Aston Martin, he walked out the door. So even with seven world titles, Lewis Hamilton, he's getting towards that sort of veteran status if he's not already there. he's going to want the time and the sort of investment in him as well as Russell is. So that would certainly be a short-term thing that Mercedes could do to boost its 2023 form, I would say.
Okay, let's move on. And a team that is having a different 2023 to 2022, Ferrari, closely fighting, this time with Aston Martin in the Constructors' Championships. The drivers, well, some races we get Leclerc on the podium. Sometimes they're barely in the points. Other races we see Sainz taking the lead and telling the pit wall exactly what the strategy is going to be. Both drivers pretty level on points, just 7 between them going into the summer break. We've spoken before about how some of the teams in the chasing pack can't decide which one's going to be the quickest. Alex, I'll stay with you. What do you think about Ferrari's season so far with their new management in place, but a commitment behind the drivers? What do you think?
Well, you say it's different, Martin, but I would argue it's pretty much exactly the same. It's not good. You know, I think obviously there are differences, and of course I'm being flippant here. Like, yeah, Ferrari were winning races last year. They had different team principal, Mattia Binotto. Now it's Fred Vasseur. But really, what's changed? Red Bull got better, and Ferrari, if anything, stagnated or went backwards. Like, it really strikes me every so often I think of this. Q, I think you made this point in various podcasts and videos that we were doing this time a year ago, which is basically Ferrari's already missed its big chance. And I think we're seeing that play out exactly as you suggested it would. It had a great chance to win the 2022 title, didn't take that. Red Bull's car development path has been proved so right, now even Ferrari are on it. Where's it realistically going to overcome Red Bull? Red Bull is so much further ahead. Like, it's like Ferrari essentially feels like it's getting less criticism this year because it's giving like fractionally more openness from its team. Vasseur is admitting to the really obvious mistakes we can see when it comes to like not listening to its drivers, wanting slicks in Canada and things like that. Oh, okay, yeah, we made mistakes. Yeah, we know you made mistakes, Fred. Like, obviously, Ferrari thinks it's getting less criticism because of that. It's not. It's just because people are just going, oh yeah, all right. Yeah, what else is new? Ferrari, yeah. Oh, another long pit stop for Leclerc. Brilliant. Yeah, okay. Another one for Sainz. Yeah, cool. Both drivers got held up. Actually, it wasn't Ferrari's fault, but both drivers got held up with the same thing when it came to changing the full wets for Inters in the Spa sprint race. It was just classic Ferrari. That in that case, misfortune. But nobody's surprised about this anymore. And I think that's the case. Little has really changed. You know, we had unreliability even hitting Leclerc in Bahrain. Thankfully, that hasn't become the big issue that it was last year. But yeah, it's just been exposed. It is making new signings, new investment. You know, people are actually leaving. Laurent Mekies is off. You've got David Sanchez going to McLaren. It's just, we know how things go in Formula One. Ferrari can make new signings, but its biggest one, that isn't coming until 2025. So it's just, it's more of the same, and it's just frustrating. And really, for a team that has the support and love that Ferrari has from F1 fans, it's actually quite sad.
Wind back, if you remember, to when the cars were unveiled, and usually it's a sort of a dust cover gets yanked off. But if we remember, Ferrari actually ran their car at Fiorano, and okay, that's like not trivial, but it doesn't mean anything. And of course, the drivers are going to go over radio. This feels mega. But it just felt like a show of strength at the time that, you know, they'd refined that car, and everyone was worried about how the aerodynamic testing restrictions would affect Red Bull, and, you know, they're just bringing RB18B. And so maybe, you know, okay, like I said last year, it felt like that was Ferrari's one chance gone. But with Red Bull anticipated to only take a small step forward, you know, it felt like Ferrari could close the gap. And as Alex says, apart from sort of the Haas's breaking down at Silverstone and Leclerc in Bahrain, generally the car has been a lot more reliable. But there's still two major areas of weakness before we get into performance, and that's strategy and pit stops. Pit stops is something that Fred Vasseur, I think, really tangibly could have an effect in, is in you just say, right, practice it over the winter, practice it Thursday, Friday, throughout the weekend. But they're still fouling with pit stops, sticky wheel guns, poor execution. And the strategy, like Alex says, there's been less media attention on it, but the errors are still there. And I think that's related to basically pressure, that as soon as there is pressure, Ferrari falter. Last year, there was a lot more pressure towards the start of the season because they were up front. So when, you know, Silverstone, they got their safety car order wrong, or Hungary, you know, after doing everything on mediums and softs, they bet their whole race on hard tyres unfathomably. But that was because they were going for the win. This year, you know, as soon as the pressure's up again, they're making mistakes. You know, the fact that, yes, it speaks well of Carlos Sainz how sort of articulate and intelligent he is. But the fact is, like, mid-race, when he really needs to be driving, he's having to barter with the pit wall over what to do, and they're suggesting one thing, and he's going, no, I'm doing the other. At least that's not broadcast from other teams, whether it is or not going on, but it's not exactly convincing. And then you have, you know, the performance drop-off relative to Red Bull, and the slight understanding that basically, Ferrari was very quick last year, but when they emerged, they were already much closer to the performance potential or the performance ceiling of that concept. And so there was only however many steps forward they could take, and that's basically carried over to this year. So a bit like Mercedes, whether they need to take a few steps back and go in a slightly different route, but then that puts them so much further behind in their learning. And then, yeah, I've just got to side with Alex and everything else, that the changes aren't coming until 2025. And then suddenly that sort of Ferrari unwanted record of a 21-year drought between titles, suddenly that's pretty in reach, isn't it? As we go forward to sort of the next gen rules era.
Absolutely, even the win record of the sort of the time we've had to wait. It was the 10th of July, I think, last year, Austrian Grand Prix. Last time we saw a Ferrari win. As you say, we see plenty of Ferrari poles, but Leclerc has that really kind of unenviable growing reputation of, well, he won't win from pole, because we know who will win. Right, we've spoken about teams 2, 3, 4, 5. Time for, without question, number one in 2023. After Spa, we did the Sunday night podcast review show, and Matt summed it up so well, because I was trying to find new angles. Always got to talk about Max Verstappen and Red Bull. We can't just say, oh, he won, here's the rest. And he summed it up beautifully and mentioned it in the intro as well, which is that RB19 isn't a magic trick car. It's not a Brabham fan car. They haven't turned up because of, engine regulations with some sort of 2,000 horsepower, fire breather, but the aero's naff. It's just really, really good everywhere, and they happen to have the top dog driver behind the wheel as well. Red Bull dominance this year. Trying to sum up just how good that car driver team performance is. Longest running team principal in the pit lane in Christian Horner. Absolute consistency in that team as well. And a very good teammate in Sergio Perez as well. At times this year putting up a good fight. Matt, I'll stay with you because you really helped crystallise my thoughts on that podcast about why that RB19 is so good. As we reflect back on the first half of the season, what are your thoughts on Red Bull so far?
Well, it's got the perfect win record, hasn't it? It's won everything, every sprint race, every Grand Prix. But like I say, it's potentially not the perfect car. So it's not, if we're thinking of the pantheon of greats, it's not a Lotus 72. Okay, inboard brakes was a bit of a wrong sort of path to go down. But in terms of repositioning the radiators, and every car since then has done what Lotus 72. So it's not one of those. It's not the MP44 where just the performance is otherworldly to the rest of the competition. Like, we have seen that the Red Bull can be caught, and I don't buy the narrative that Verstappen is sandbagging every now and again in qualifying. Well, we've seen half a second cover 20 cars. He's much braver and more calculated than I would be if he's going to only drive at 9/10 to secure that pole position. He's putting a lot at stake. So I think we have seen sort of where basically how fast the RB19 can go. And yes, Verstappen is doing his thing of basically starting a race, keeping out of trouble, clearing the DRS zone to be 1.5 seconds ahead, then leaning on the tyre, sort of gradually bringing the window, and then he clears off and it's a 20-30 second lead. That is mega. But I think actually, as our colleague John Noble wrote, what you're seeing is like the Renault early Honda years in the wilderness coming good. So first of all, when we had the winter between 2021 and 2022, everyone started sort of rereading Adrian Newey's autobiography because he talked about his experience with ground effects. That was one point. But also, when basically Mercedes was winning everything, Red Bull knew the Renault engine, later Tag Heuer, wasn't all it was cracked up to be. They were looking for every other area to find potential. And a lot of that came down to ride height and rear suspension. Mercedes were more good at, I think, not necessarily having the sweetest handling car, but just chucking downforce on it by bolting on, even more complex barge board front wings. well, the entire regulations have shifted towards now what that Red Bull area of expertise were, which is why they came out the block so good in last year, but also why they've stayed ahead. Because, you know, look at Spa. So much of that is about ride height to maintain it through Eau Rouge, whatever, having the right rear axle to placate Max Verstappen. They're brilliant at all of that. And that is why you now have that car with a massive operating window compared to rivals. It's also why Red Bull have been really good at the way the floor and the diffuser interact with the rear wing. Well, the rear wing in the previous generation of cars was sort of a more overlooked area of development, I feel, compared to what it is now. But Red Bull, because they're ahead, they're able to look at that and really refine it. And so I think, yeah, operationally, pit stops, they're operating they're on a different plane to rivals. But okay, Red Bull would say this, and you know, you've got the ATR, which may come to hurt them more in 2024, because it certainly hasn't at this point at the start of the season. And after the big Budapest upgrade, I'm not sure we're expecting too much else more. But they're saying, like, it's not 09 with a double diffuser, it's not an F duct. This car can be caught, or certainly people can get a hell of a lot closer to what they are doing, but they're not. So Red Bull has been brilliant, and this Class B behind them has been exciting to watch as well. But it's up to the others to sort of take that step and close the gap, but they're not doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. You makes me think there, how much is the cost cap having an effect? Because you surely say that 20 years ago, Ferrari and Mercedes would have just built a Red Bull by now. That they just would have just gone completely washed everything out. So it is an interesting thing. We've got to always consider how much harder it is now with those financial constraints. And actually, I think in terms of looking forward for Red Bull, the cost cap is going to be the next, is it a nervy moment because of what happened last year? Now, I'm not saying that Red Bull have done anything wrong. It's just that that's how the news cycle goes. At a certain point, the FIA is going to reveal whether anybody is in trouble for breaching the 2022 cost cap. There's been reports that a few teams are suspected of doing that, which the FIA then very firmly clamped down and denied and said, look, there's been absolutely no talk. This is just speculation. It's nothing that's been released to any of the teams yet. So, I'm just saying, logically, you'd expect that to be the next big news talking point, and obviously Red Bull's a big part of that because of what happened last year. But actually, I just want to go back to what Matt was saying about, comparing this RB19 to some great cars. Actually, you mentioned the McLaren and the Lotus, Matt, but our boss, Kevin Turner, he's already made this point for us. It's the F2004, which is considered a great car because it's not dominant in qualifying, but it's crushingly good in the races. And that's what the RB19 is. And I think, it almost means that the RB19, in certain ways, we calculate how good a car is by the super times method, that is the fastest lap of each car over a weekend expressed as a percentage. It does the RB19 a disservice because in qualifying, the other teams are able to get close to it, occasionally ahead of it, as we've seen with Mercedes, as we've seen with Charles Leclerc a couple of times in Baku. So that ultimately it doesn't express best, that approach, but there's no doubt that the RB19 is. And the only other thing I just want to say for Red Bull is, for all the criticism, and it's not even like it's criticism because everyone's just like, oh, there's no opposition, for all the disappointment that it's one team winning, Red Bull still provide a lot of storylines that I actually don't think it gets credit for. Like, for example, the team order spat in Brazil last year, totally needless. Everybody loved it, apart from, probably some Red Bull people, Red Bull fans, things like that. But just take in isolation Max Verstappen's engineer, Gian Piero Lambiase, and how they talk to each other. It's not as good as seeing any other team battle Verstappen and make him show his tremendous skills to win a really close dogfight, to win a really close championship fight. Of course, it's not as good as that, but at least it's interesting. And Red Bull could very easily stop that from happening, but they don't, and I think that's to their credit. And then you add into the fact that they dropped Nick de Vries, they brought Ricciardo back. Helmut Marko at 80 years old is still his utterly most brutal persona going. So for a team that sort of crushes the life out of F1 at the moment, it's also putting some back into it.
On Helmut, I don't know if it was widely shown or not, but it wasn't in Spa, but it was a couple of races before. He wanted to get to the front of the barriers to cheer on his man, and there was one of the photographers, one of the snappers, was leaning up against the little temporary barrier. And Helmut, in all his years, has still got a pretty good elbow on him. It was like, right, son, out of the way. And the guy sort of looked over the photographer to say, do you think you are? And saw him was like, yeah, I'll just move out of your way. So still fearsome. I love that little shot. I'm not even sure it was even sort of in focus or in the main coverage, but I caught it in the background. I thought it was absolutely brilliant moment. But there we go.
Can I just jump in very quickly, Martin, with another Helmut Marko? This one's a grid anecdote, but that one was obviously in Parc Ferme. F1's first race in Saudi Arabia. I was there. Now I have many thoughts on the situation we're in with Saudi Arabia buying up loads of sport and sport washing and all of that, and Formula One is of course part of it. But that's a whole other debate podcast, and a very worthy one as well. But just for the purposes of this anecdote, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, MBS, obviously in the news for the murder and everything of the journalist in Istanbul. He was on the grid for that first race. He was being fawned over by the F1 higher ups, by Jean Todt, the FIA president at the time. They're walking through the grid. I was stood by, I think it was Perez's Red Bull on the grid in Jeddah, not too far from Helmut Marko. As this procession came through with this gigantic, quite fearsome reputation guy, Marko just went straight up to him, literally shook his hand out, started having an animated conversation with a global world leader. So he does not lack bravado. He's pretty fearless, and his reputation is well deserved.
Absolutely. Well, we've done a good big chunk on the big teams. Not to say that the rest of the teams aren't equally as important, of course, for fans watching this of those teams. But we haven't got to spend quite as long on the remaining teams who are fighting just as hard with just as dedicated teams. So if you're a fan of those teams, we don't spend as much time on them. There's absolutely nothing meant by that. But obviously the debate has to be, more, Red Bull than some of the lower down teams. But let's get on to those now. We will start with the most recent story, I guess, which is the Alpine personnel changes, losing huge amounts of experience there. Otmar Safnauer has been, he's new there, but been in motorsport and Formula One for absolutely forever. Alan Permain in that squad for 34 years, and other changes there as well from maybe leaders, more kind of automotive based side there at Renault and Alpine, who perhaps aren't as well versed in the politics of motorsport and how the whole thing works, etc. But there's lots to do there. May I suggest steadying the ship over the summer and kind of coming back strong. Alex, I'll stay with you. Any thoughts on Alpine?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually shown a fair bit of potential. We had the Ocon podium, we had Pierre Gasly mixing it very gamely with Fernando Alonso at Silverstone, and it's had a lot of misfortune. You think about the late restart chaos in Australia, 2 cars out in the same incident there, 2 cars out in the same incident at Hungary that was very much not Ocon or Gasly's fault. So yeah, it has shown flashes. It's just not been consistent. It's not made the Aston Martin step, the McLaren step up the midfield that we talked about earlier. I think, there's a lot of emphasis on we're a race team. You won't hear any sort of cost cap shenanigans going on at Alpine. Well, okay, there's one way of looking at it, but big investment clearly has paid off for other teams. So that's one way to look at it. But also, it's now got a really, really big call to make, which is who's going to be its boss going forward. You've got Bruno Famin as the temporary team principal. He's going to eventually be part of the structure that will sit above the new team principal. There's a lot of assumptions that it's going to be Matteo Binotto. I would say that that's not a given, because with Alpine, you've essentially got a sort of mini Ferrari situation. You've got a team where there's rather obviously a lot of interference from the board level and things at the top, because look what's happened. They've gone through a whole management overhaul after Cyril Abitbol was running the team. Then you had the Alpine rebrand, which was a thing that Renault wanted to do to boost the Alpine brand. Then you've got Otmar Safnauer gone. I mean, it's just interference after interference after interference. So why would Binotto, having been pushed out of the fire, jump into the frying pan, or whatever the expression is there? I've probably butchered it horrifically. But whatever, if they get the call right, they just need to give it time, because that's how things goes. It's not it's not football. You don't get the new manager bounce. But the other thing is engine equalisation. That's a big topic at the moment. We know that the Renault engine is down compared to the others. The FIA have noticed it, or it's been pointed out to the FIA, and they're supporting an investigation into potentially addressing that. So in the sort of mid-term, that theoretically provides a boost for Alpine, if not everybody else being brought to their level in terms of the engine stakes. So that could be a net gain for them.
I think on track, Alpine's glitzy pre-season launch, their target was respectable, actually. It was to do what we did last year, finish 4th, meanwhile close the gap to the top three, and we'll do this by out developing everyone else. And that sort of made sense on paper, because last year, every time they put a new part on the car, it works. It gave them a performance uptick. They weren't spending 3 races evaluating it, so it was all plausible. But yeah, it's just obviously not worked on track, and it's not as like the car's inconsistent. It's consistently not as good as the other cars around it, and so that's the problem. But then off track, as Alex says, everyone's investing. Well, Enstone's had, it's had its redecoration, if you like, and there's not the huge. Okay, there's a new sim coming, some new, they're collecting CVs for aerodynamicists, but there's not a huge like upgrade coming. And then, the management of it all, basically Luca Di Maio, Renault Group boss, meet Jaguar in the early 2000s, Jaguar meet Luca Di Maio. It's that kind of, what, F1 teams need time, everyone else is doing an 18-month infrastructure project. Well, no, I want success tomorrow. It doesn't work like that. And while like everyone's talking about the replacement, I think, to compare it to football, and comparing F1 to football always has limitations in its analogies, but you look at Watford, right? And the management turnover there, same with Alpine. Does the next person go in oblivious to the turnover and think they'll get a big stay of execution, or does the person go in knowing full well they might do an Otmar and be gone after 18 months? And if so, I don't think you want either of those people. You don't want someone short-sighted and a bit Machiavellian looking out for themselves, and you don't want someone so oblivious as to what's going on as to take charge of the whole operation. So yes, and they can't promote from within because there's hardly anyone left, so that's the sort of state of the nation at Alpine.
All right, let's talk Williams and some recent races in Silverstone as well. On the right circuit and at Spa, flashes of performance from Williams. Right circuit, right setup. Actually, they've got a bit of a turn of pace at times. How can Williams push forward?
Yeah, I think sort of long term, it's James Vowles and his battle with the sort of capex changes to the rules to allow the investment to be changed. To allow the infrastructure to be changed with investment at Williams factory. But that's very much a sort of Sun Tzu art of war thing. You're fighting the battles that never need to be fought, etc., etc. And as part of that, Vowles has been open in saying, he told me in Spain, I know he spoke to Matt in Belgium, he doesn't mind making Williams look bad if it makes F1 wake up and realise, okay, we've got to change a few things to help them catch up. The danger there is that the other big teams will exploit those changes because that's just what they do. That's very much long term though. Short term, keep supporting Alex Albon. He's very happy there. He has made the odd mistake this year, we think, at the start in Baku, damaging his front wing there, but otherwise been excellent. And while he does that, the focus then falls on Logan Sargent. He's a rookie, so Williams has got to encourage him. But I wouldn't be surprised if there are other drivers out there eyeing his seat. It's no guarantee that he'll be there in 2024. So Williams publicly supportive of Sargent because Vowles is really polished. Actually, Q and I have praised Stella. Vowles is another team principal that's come in this season and has made a very good impact with the media. I hope with fans as well. He's just not flap. He doesn't flap at all. Like he just gets it, and he just is very polished. And also I saw someone dropped a chair down some stairs in the Williams motorhome while we were doing our interviews. Vowles looked furious. He covered it up very well when he came back in, having discovered that fortunately someone hadn't broken their neck or anything, but he wasn't best pleased. So anyway, he's made a good impression. His next big call, looking for 24, do I keep Sargent or not? Because it wasn't his decision to hire in the first place at Williams.
I'm similarly convinced by Vowles as well. But the Williams targets are much further down the line. The one of the things Vowles said to me is that I don't care about finding an extra millisecond of performance for this season if it means taking anything away from the longer term plan. And while he's not going to do an Alpine 100 race target strategy, whatever. Dorilton is an investment company and he sits on the board of that. So he has to present certain timelines. And as Alex says, they're all wrapped up in CapEx. Just to add to the Sargent point, Vowles isn't the sort of person to second guess himself. And he's already decided in a previous career at Mercedes, looking after junior drivers, that Sargent didn't sort of pass muster. It wasn't Vowles's appointment, or it wasn't Vowles's decision ultimately to sign him for this season, as much as he has publicly backed him. So yes, I think Logan's acquitted himself well in the sense that he's not causing too many random safety cars. The standard of driving has been, solid enough to a fault from the entire field, but that, we could every now and again deal with a random crash just to spice up the race a bit. But I don't think he should be sort of, or maybe his agent should be putting out feelers in sports cars. I don't know, something along those lines.
Let's talk Haas next, and in a sport that can be so often about appearances. When they turned up with their mini pit wall at the beginning of the year, people might have smirked until Gunter pointed out, well, hey, if I spend $250,000 on performance and get better results, who will be laughing? And everyone kind of went, oh yeah, okay, I guess he's got a point. But let's talk about performance on track. At times, seen turns of pace, some decent results, Quali, Canada, Miami, North America, which is handy for them being Haas. But some thoughts on Haas, please.
Great qualifying, bad racing. Next. No, in all seriousness. Hulkenberg, great comeback. Really seems to be enjoying himself. I think just reveling in the fact that he's got this sort of last real chapter to his F1 career. Qualifying star. And actually, I said Andreas Stella was my signing / promotion of 2023. I'll add Hulkenberg as joint. He's definitely a top signing. So top signing from Haas there. Magnussen's not been awful in qualifying. Think back to Miami. He was very, very high up the grid there. But yeah, they just can't get a handle on this, sliding problem in traffic that wears their tyres out. And it's surprising that it's taking this long, that they just can't correct everything there. But the other thing I'd just say about Haas is I spent quite a lot of time with the team this season, particularly at Silverstone, but other races as well. You read about that in an upcoming feature in GP Racing magazine, our other magazine that we produce here at Motorsport Network. But basically what I found there is a really stable, mature, professional atmosphere, which I think has been lacking in recent seasons. When you think about Nikita Mazepin and Mick Schumacher, trying to crash into each other all the time in 2021, Schumacher crashing multiple times in 2022, and the pressure that created internally, you've got a very stable Haas at the moment. And I think that if they can use that to turn it onto their problems when it comes to tyre degradation, you're going to see the Haas of old that can produce some pretty good results, I would say.
Let's move on to Alfa Romeo. Of course, just the name of a title headline sponsor of that team who are leaving. We've just talked about Haas. Could we see the Alfa Romeo Haas on the grid next year? Well, we can't say. But as of recording this, we can say that they won't be with this team in the long term. But this team does have long-term plans, though. This season, though, stuck down in 9th. They've fallen down Formula One's ranks compared to 2022. How can they climb back in the second half of this year?
Well, I'm willing to bet that actually out of all the teams, Alfa Romeo is the one we've talked about on podcasts and videos at least, and the one we've written about. But that's partly because they're so not very interesting at times. And that is because, the drivers are stable, good operators, but, everything's been about Audi buying their team and developing its own program. Well, the noise is from Audi, actually, that the engine program is behind where it should be compared to Red Bull and Mercedes. But on track, it might still be Alfa Romeo, and underneath that badge, it might say Sauber, but Audi is now piling resources into this team so it can finally spend up to the cost cap, and the team has done nothing with that. Yeah, okay, it bolted on a few new parts, and Silverstone was slightly better at Hungary. It's fallen back in Spa. It's so underwhelming. Like, you'd at least want the chassis size to be developing, and the problem with this year's car and last year's car is that it was light. That was why it was so quick at the start of last season. It was down at the weight limit. Well, every other team can get down to that weight limit, but it's then hard to find performance for Alfa Romeo in other areas that they've lost their area of strength over the rest. And also you speak to the team about what's gone wrong. It's just like, well, basically this and that, and we need everything needs a bit more work, and that's fine. Take a holistic view. But there's no low-hanging fruit, so they jump those next 2 or 3 places. So it's just a bit stagnant, a bit really around Alfa Romeo.
Okay, and unfortunately in last place they've scored 1 point 3 times this year, dropping Nick de Vries, bringing back Daniel Ricciardo, which was a big talking point of the 2023 season so far. I think he's acquitted himself pretty well so far. He still looks in amazing shape. He's obviously still been hitting the gym. Being race fit is probably a different thing, that last few percent, but that will come, and Daniel hopefully has lost none of his speed and can help that team develop. But what do you think AlphaTauri need to do to try and make a bit of a comeback and not finish last this year?
they just need to score points. I mean, they've enacted what's actually quite a large scale recovery in terms of its development path after it missed its targets in terms of especially the corner entry phase. The downforce is coming off as the car brakes. It missed its targets there, and I think they've added considerable steps really quite early on to try and address that. You think of the floor updates they brought to Australia, so carry on down that path and then just hope that things fall their way. I think it's interesting, isn't it? You sort of make your own luck, and I think we've seen that with Williams. They've really grabbed hold of those positive results where they can, and AlphaTauri just haven't. How many 11th places has Yuki Tsunoda had? And I think it's a complex one at AlphaTauri because you've got Daniel Ricciardo there, who is essentially, if he does well, he's possibly back on the way back to Red Bull. If he does badly, it's confirmation that that's it. His F1 career's over. So there's quite a lot of pressure, but he's still being very Daniel Ricciardo about it all. And there's lots of pressure on Yuki Tsunoda as well because he doesn't have a contract for next year. And Liam Lawson is doing very, very well in Super Formula, could well be brought over to replace Tsunoda. So, and don't forget there's a name change coming up. So that'll be the sort of the big news topic for AlphaTauri, which will be what will it be called next year and what drivers will it have. But there's not a lot they can do other than just try and improve the car. And if the drivers make the cut, they make the cut.
Yeah, I think, the big talking point has obviously been dropping De Vries. And that, as good as the performance that was in Monza last season, standing in for Alex Albon, even if the car was slightly low drag and the team expected Albon would have done better still. That one race is far too small a sample size to promote a driver within. And I can understand why they did it, but also De Vries he was part of the Alpine shootout, didn't get the nod there. So, the right decision probably for him to go, because not only did he start low, but he wasn't improving strong enough. I think, was it Marko, another devastating line? We didn't see one lap that convinced us or, one lap that amazed us. So that's him gone. Bringing Ricciardo's in good. It's a good, like you say, good benchmark for Tsunoda. And also, Ricciardo's won, all right, a little while ago now, but it's won 8 Grand Prix, and okay, Toro Rosso, then AlphaTauri's won 2 Grand Prix, so it knows what the top step's like, but Ricciardo's bringing so much more experience, so much more competing ideas from McLaren and Renault than Pierre Gasly and, Brendan Hartley, Daniel Kvyat ever had. Okay, they got a bit of Red Bull seat time, but, so he's able to bring the team forward, and we know Red Bull management thinks AlphaTauri isn't selling enough genes or whatever through Formula One, so it's a rebrand. It's going to consolidate in Bicester and sort of scale back its fines or operations. But yeah, I think I'll sort of the final thing I'll say in this podcast is still my favourite stat from this season is that Aston Martin sporting director Andy Stevenson has overturned 2 penalties to earn 5 points. That puts him 2 points ahead of AlphaTauri in the standings.
I know who is buying AlphaTauri stuff, by the way. It's Christian Klein, the funnily enough, ex-Red Bull Formula 1 driver turned Austrian TV commentator, because I saw him on the grid in Spa with many AlphaTauri logos on him as far as I could see.
I'm sure that's just free stuff that he's been sent, come on. It certainly beats some of the, free T-shirts that do the rounds of my weekend slobbing about wearing. But there we go, that's our show for today. And we'd love to hear from you. What do you think? Leave us a comment below. Get that discussion going about your favourite drivers and teams, where they have shone this year and who you think needs to buck their ideas up in the second half of the season. And can anybody get the chase on Red Bull? If not this year, then what they got to do to catch them next year as well. But for now, here we are in Formula One's summer break. So do enjoy that if you are having a break as well. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.